History as it happens, May 6, 2021. Going deeper on immigration.
Immigration has always been essential to America. Let's end our exhausting war over immigration.
The surge of unaccompanied minors at the southern border was the first crisis of the Biden presidency. A record 19,000 of them entered custody in March. Since then, the number held by the Border Patrol in crammed holding cells has dropped dramatically. If the crowding crisis is abating, that doesn't mean the root problems have been solved. Maybe we're getting the border crisis all wrong. Let's rethink the border and go deeper on immigration next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
For more than 30 years, politicians have talked about immigration reform, and we've done nothing about it. It's time to fix it.
The number of unaccompanied migrant kids held by the Border Patrol has plummeted about 90% since late March, according to news reports. And not because migrants stopped coming. The reason is the Biden administration's scramble to convert convention centers and military facilities around the country into makeshift shelters to take pressure off the Border Patrol. So for now, it appears at least that part of the border surge has been dealt with. But let's avert our eyes from the border for a moment. From the images of desperate humans wading across rivers or sitting in holding cells, and ask, why is it that every few months, year after year after year, we're talking about this same problem? Maybe if there were a solution, we would have discovered it already. Because when it comes to immigration from Central and South America, the causes are many. And we got into some of those causes in an episode published back on March 30th called The Border Surge. You can go back and check it out. We talked about poverty, violence, narcotics, U.S. foreign policy. We're going to build on that conversation today because immigration is an issue that spans the legal system, labor markets, foreign policy, you name it. So it would seem that no single piece of legislation could suffice. But some politicians believe they might be able to settle on at least a partial solution. Here's President Biden in his address to a joint session of Congress.
On day one of my presidency, I kept my commitment and sent a comprehensive immigration bill to the United States Congress. If you believe we need to secure the border, pass it because it has a lot of money for high-tech border security. If you believe in a pathway to citizenship, pass it. It's over 11 million undocumented folks, the vast majority of here overstaying visas. Pass it. We can actually, if you actually want to solve a problem, I've sent a bill to take a close look at it.
Given the climate in Washington, it is unclear if Congress can muster the votes. So let's take this one step further. Maybe the immigration problem isn't a problem, especially one that would require a law enforcement solution. Maybe we need to look at immigration instead as a reality of history, an unstoppable force, the flow of human beings from one part of the globe to another, that our country actually needs. Not saying this is the case, just want you to consider it. So, for instance, maybe the idea of building a wall across some or most of a 2,000-mile-long border is not what the moment calls for. As President Biden said, most of the illegal immigrants in the country came here legally. What would a wall do for them? Just something to keep in mind while listening to my conversation with Paul McBride, Ithaca College professor emeritus of 20th century American history. He specialized in the field of immigration history. Paul McBride, welcome.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, Martin. It's good to see you for sure.
And in the interest of full disclosure, before we launch into our conversation about immigration, our listeners should know that we've been friends for a long time. Many years ago, you were one of my professors.
And you used to follow me to my office after class because you always had questions and challenges. So it was a pleasure to have you in class and a pleasure to have kept in touch with you these years.
I thought I always followed you to your office to yell at you about the grades you gave me, too. that could explain some of my problems today. So, as I mentioned in the podcast, you specialized in the history of immigration in the 20th century United States. And I think the theme of this episode was to go deeper on immigration, to try to set aside all of our prejudices and biases or just assumptions about the, quote, border crisis and take a look at this with a fresh pair of eyes. So let's start with this. When we focus on the border crisis, what are we missing?
Well, first of all, I should point out that given my age, you may not have a fresh set of eyes here, but you're right. I was a specialist in 20th century history, but the scope of immigration history, of course, goes all the way back to the beginning. And so in that respect, I was doing work in the full range of immigration history. But yes, I think that the emphasis on the border crisis takes away from us understanding the border itself. It's one thing to build a wall. It's another thing to build a wall across a swamp or across a deep river. So the border itself is very important to understand. And it's 2,000 miles long. The border between the United States and Mexico extends from 19 miles out in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Southern California, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. That 2,000 mile border represents, to one side of the equation, Mexico, its supreme national catastrophe. In the course of the Mexican War, which from Mexico's point of view was entirely unjustified. President Polk had simply made up a false accusation about American troops being attacked on American soil by Mexican troops. He was challenged by a congressman from Illinois who insisted that Polk come before Congress and show him where this happened, because it didn't happen. That congressman was Abraham Lincoln. And so when the war ended, Mexico had lost 970,000 square miles of its territory. It had lost about 300,000 of its people. From their point of view, from Mexico's point of view, there has been no event in their history which is more impactful or calamitous than that. So that border covers 4 complete states. All 4 of those states in their entirety were Mexican territory, plus parts of Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, for goodness sakes. All of this was lost to the Mexicans. So that one of the important results of that is a deep resentment on the part of the people of Mexico over what's happened historically. And that's not a minor thing. This 2,000-mile border stretches through mountains and wilderness. On the Texas border, it follows 1,200 miles of the Rio Grande River. And if you flew over that river, you would see it doubles back on itself, it curves, it changes its course. After major flooding seasons, new channels are cut. Islands that were in the middle of the river or on one side or the other, at one moment change countries because the river changes, and large parts of the land on the American side are owned by ranchers.
Sounds like you're saying history and geography combine to make this a border in name only, really.
That's true. In fact, we didn't even have a border patrol along the entire border until 1924, when we passed the National Origins Act, which all but cut off migration to this country from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. The Greeks, the Slavs, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Jews, the Italians. It was kind of late on them because they were already here in large numbers, but we all but stopped immigration from those countries because we considered them too far removed from our Anglo-Saxon roots. And so the result was that we finally had a border patrol. But before that, the border was developing in such a way that we see now. There are dozens of cities along the border where there's really 2 cities, like El Paso and Juarez. And there are several of these cities in which the connection between the 2s are deep and wide. In some of the Mexican cities, there's a fairly sizable contingent of American citizens who live on the Mexican side because it's cheaper, and they come across the border every day in order to go to work. That's interesting because not only is this border the 10th longest border, international border in the world, but it is by far the most heavily crossed each year. Every year, 350 million people come across the border, 48 different border crossings, Some of them are bridges, some are walkways, some are roads, some are ferry boat landings. And so 350 million, think about that a second. That's more than the entire population of the United States each year that come over legally.
So, Paul, how would you respond to someone who says history is important? I get what you're saying, but the Mexican-American War was 100 and whatever, 60 years ago. Why is that relevant to what I'm reading about in the paper every day? That, we're being swamped, so to speak, by unaccompanied minors who are filling up detention centers.
Well, that gets to a number of issues. One, of course, and we should discuss this in more detail, but one is the question of, do we really have an immigration problem? And what is that problem? But the other is, what can we do in the present situation to ameliorate the inundation across the border because of the crisis that we're facing? And it is a crisis. Part of that crisis is that in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, those nations have become narco states. And they're narco states because the United States has been so intent on making drug issues part of the policing and illegal that we've turned the enormously profitable enterprise of supplying the United States with drugs over to cartels and illegal enterprises. The result is that in those three countries and also in Mexico, the drug cartels are so powerful that they're more powerful by far than the government can deal with. So part of the issue is working on the drug issue in a different way that will not turn south of the border countries into narco states that chase their people here. The other is establishing, we've got to have the infrastructure to deal with people who are trying to get refugee status. We have a law that says they have the right to claim refugee status. We have a law that says that if we try to deport someone from here, they can apply for asylum. But we don't have the infrastructure that can implement that law in a fair and relatively quick way. The result is that it's completely broken.
A note about the narco states. In Honduras itself, the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, it's been reported that prosecutors in New York say he helped facilitate cocaine shipments from Honduras and, according to court documents, claimed to have embezzled American aid money through sham nonprofits. I mean, that's part of this problem, that so much of the aid that has been sent has been taken by corrupt leaders. And you said something before that's really remarkable, how the drug cartels are stronger than their home governments. That's not something that we can really relate to here in the United States.
What that suggests is that if the United States approach was different, if we treated drug abuse as a medical problem and addressed drug issues as legal but treatable, we would undermine drastically the power of the illegal establishment from being able to gain enormous profits by feeding it. Instead, of course, we've made massive efforts to destroy fields of dope in Afghanistan and so on. And we've spent an enormous amount of time in our now incarcerated state in punishing people who get involved in the drug trade. A major rethinking of our approach to this issue is in order, and it should be provoked by the realization in very recent years that one of the worst offenders is the pharmaceutical companies. And the opioid crisis that we faced in the last 5 to 10 years has been generated solely by the predatory efforts of the Sackler family and their pharmaceutical companies.
Well, Paul, let's return to your earlier point about whether we actually have an immigration problem and how our focus on the border distracts from other issues. Most of the people who are in the country illegally came here legally, but they overstayed their documentation.
Yeah, that's an important point and often overlooked. We've been so obsessed with the southern border that we don't realize there's about 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States today. Approximately 80% of those came here through LaGuardia. They had visas They came to the United States as students or as part of a research team involved with American researcher on this or that problem. They overstayed their visas, or after their graduation, their visas ended, but Apple hired them, or Intel. And the companies have been fighting ever since to get them full status. But America's immigration laws are so labyrinthine and the procedures involved so difficult. And the growing animosity and fear of immigrants has been such a major factor that there's really deep resistance to keeping these people. They're all illegal aliens, right? So what that means is that even if we were able to build a wall that would seal the border completely and it couldn't be tunneled under or laddered over, we wouldn't address 80% of the undocumented immigrant issues. And that raises the question of what kind of a problem do the undocumented immigrants represent? Forbes magazine had an article just a few years ago that showed that undocumented immigrants contribute $11.6 billion in taxes every year. Immigrants in total, including the legal immigrants, contribute $458.7 billion in taxes. Think about that a second. So you're in a relatively small town, but you've had an influx of 1,000 immigrants in recent years because a new plant has opened up. Those immigrants are parts of families. They buy clothes for their kids. They buy shoes for their kids and bicycles. All of those things they pay sales taxes on. They pay rent. And so that rent comes back to the government when the owners have to pay their property taxes. They have jobs, and all of their paychecks have the Social Security tax deducted, and the companies pay their share of that Social Security tax. So those people who have studied that particular issue closely say that illegal immigrants are critically important for keeping Social Security alive. But of course, they'll never get a dime out of it, because if they raise their head above water, they'll be deported. Even if your community starts screaming about all these people coming in that they don't want to have there, the truth of the matter is, well, they might have to build an annex to the high school because there's a lot more kids going to school. That in itself creates jobs for the people who have to build the building, the people who have to maintain it. More teachers have to be hired. What I'm saying is that they have an expansive impact on the economy that generates jobs and money exchange and business that is helpful to the economy. Even illegal immigrants pay more into the country than it costs us that they're here.
I think now is a good time to introduce the Postville raid into this conversation. Postville, Iowa, May 12, 2008, as an example of what happens when the law is enforced. It makes little economic sense.
It was the site of the largest crackdown on undocumented immigrants in American history. It happened in the waning months of the George W. Bush administration, and it involved 900 ICE agents, FBI agents, or Homeland Security agents, many of them dressed in full combat gear, who descended on this town, which was about 2,700 population. But in the 90s, a family had established a kosher meatpacking plant in Postville, and it quickly became the largest such meatpacking plant in the United States, employing some 800 workers. And they brought workers primarily from Guatemala and Mexico, helped them to get here, and then helped them to get Social Security cards, even though they knew they were illegal. And there was some abuse of and exploitation of these workers. But the workers themselves transformed Postville. The people of Postville have since been interviewed to death because this thing was a major issue. They were saying, they were really resentful. They didn't know who these people were. They couldn't speak English. They were from Mexico and Guatemala, and this is an estate where 5% of the people were non-white, but 25% of the people were non-white in Postville. And so there was a lot of adjustment by the locals. But the result was, in no time at all, there were Hispanic restaurants, There was a large demand for Hispanic foods in the grocery stores. New businesses opened up to serve them. People were able to rent their extra rooms. People were buying homes, and the economy was booming. The kids were going to school, had to hire more teachers. And because they were from Guatemala and Mexico, the Catholic Church became an important institution in that state, and a largely Protestant state. And so when that crackdown hit, they invaded the plant. They chased people across fields who were running for their lives. Kids would get calls in school, or those that were still home, telling them one young man 10 years later was interviewed. He said, "My mom called. I could hear her screaming on the other side of the line. She didn't know what was going to happen to her." And the kids were just traumatized. Their parents were taken to a city 80 miles away for interrogation. They were charged with federal felonies. There was a separation of the parents from their kids, but the economic impact was catastrophic. 50 homes were repossessed by the local bank. 400 approximately people were deported. The economy collapsed. The business went bankrupt. 2 years later, it was bought by another group from Canada, and they opened it up and brought more immigrants in, but all of them legal. Some of them from Somalia, many of them from Eastern Europe and Russia. And so now, Postville is one of the most ethnically diverse communities in the country, and the economy's back on the rebound again. But that's so illustrative of the impact of immigration, legal or illegal.
Something you're getting at here is that our immigration system, such as it is, doesn't allow enough slots for unskilled laborers who we obviously need.
We need, yeah.
Yes.
You know, this has been a perennial problem for many, many years. In the post-World War II period, we had the Bracero program to bring workers legally, temporarily into America to pick our crops. And that happened, but there was a lot of, they were derisively referred to as wetbacks. Eventually, the pressure mounted to deport them, and we did, and we stopped the program. So now they come back anyway, yes, illegally, in order to do the jobs that we need to have done, because otherwise it won't get done.
Let's go back in history again to something called the Dillingham Commission, because it could illustrate what we mean when we say each generation has its own set of biases and prejudices that it projects upon the next wave of migrants coming to the country. For instance, no one today would think twice about seeing Italians, Roman Catholics, Jews, Southern Europeans walking down the street of any American city. But a century ago, when the Dillingham Commission was created, those immigrants were seen as outside the U.S. mainstream, and Congress set up this commission to do something about it.
Well, this commission was appointed in 1907 by President Theodore Roosevelt. It had its report ready by 1911 in the Taft administration, 41 volumes of research, and it is still a treasure trove of information about how all the various ethnic groups were employed and what their religion was, and how much intermarriage was going on among the various ethnic groups, and what their economic impact was. And all of that is extraordinarily interesting and valuable information, but the primary impact was contained in its summary report. And the summary report was very blunt expression of the prevailing biases at the time. The primary approach to immigration was what we've since called Anglo-Saxon conformity. We were insistent that the immigrants who come here should be Anglo-Saxons or Teutonic. Germany was okay. This was, of course, before World War I. But other sources of immigrants were decidedly beneath that. This was also the high point of American scientific racism. The eugenics movement had emerged powerfully in all the major Ivy League schools. So had phrenology. Phrenology was a pseudoscience that had chairs in Harvard and Princeton and so on, where people studied the contours of the bumps of the head. And they determined that these bumps were related to underlying structures in the brain that controlled things like intelligence and imaginativeness and creativity. And in all of their studies, they showed that the Anglo-Saxons were at the top, that the Africans were at the bottom, that the Eastern Europeans were near the bottom. And so what happened by 1924, we established the National Origins Act, and that act welcomed people from Western Europe and Northern Europe, whom we identified as Anglo-Saxon or Teutonic, and it all but cut off immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So for Italians, the Italians came over in very large numbers in the 1890s. So they weren't even here before 1890. Well, to show what it did to future Italian migration, the 1924 Act said that people from Italy could not come over in more numbers than 2% of the number of Italians who were here in 1890. Well, before that, there are very few Italians. So that cut the amount of Italians to almost nothing. The same thing for the Greeks, for all of the Eastern European Slavic people. In one of the articles about them, the article referred to the Slavic people as beaten men from beaten races. And of course, the Jews from Eastern Europe. It was a way to stop further immigration from all of those countries, nationalities, and religions. And by the way, you're being Catholic, you came to the country that was born of the Protestant Revolution. And the most important part of that was the Puritan Revolution. The Puritans came here because they were trying to purify the Church of England because it was too Catholic. So you came to just the wrong country.
Ex-Catholic in my case, but these ideas that you're describing, they were embraced by the elites in our society. This wasn't just a mob of bigots, right? These were scientists.
Oh, yeah. And my dissertation was on the settlement movement and the YMCA and those people that were working to try to help the immigrants. The settlement house movement was especially important, led by Jane Addams. And even there, and these were the good people, the bad people wanted to stop immigration altogether, keep these people out and keep America American. The good people were saying, sure, we can let them in and help them out, but we want to make them like us. And so the social settlement workers and so on, they were a lot better than the restrictionists, but they wanted to accept the immigrants on their terms, which meant, why can't they be more like us?
Yeah, so the Southern Europeans, Italians, Sicilians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans, the Jews of the early 20th century, late 19th century, today they are the Mexicans, the Guatemalans, Salvadorans, the Hondurans.
Yeah, that's interesting because you said earlier, no one would think twice about living next door to an Italian or a Greek or a Slovak or a Czech right today. Mm-hmm. And that's because we have completely rejected the Anglo-Saxon nonsense that led to the 1924 Act. Most people kind of think loosely about the melting pot, and that is we all kind of slushed together and created a new nationality. But that's not entirely true either, because it may well be that we are actually more like a tossed salad. That is, after everything gets tossed up, you can still tell the lettuce from the tomatoes. I'm Irish American. I'm not going to have the same way of looking at things as Italian Americans. But that doesn't mean that I'm not much different than my grandfather. So in any case, what I'm saying is that this whole thing about assimilation is very interesting and worth thinking about, but it's complicated. Assimilation is something that happens on its own terms. All of the immigrants that we've talked about, even those more recent ones, they've done very well. We've had large numbers, of course, of refugees coming here. The Jews and the Irish were refugees. They were fleeing to pogroms that were killing them. They were fleeing the potato famine, and they assimilated and became Americans. All of this anti-Catholic stuff. We're now living in a country where the majority on the Supreme Court is Catholic. Assimilation simply happens. And people who come here as refugees, desperate, they're not planning to go back. And so they're more likely to be willing to make whatever accommodations have to be made, because this is going to be their new home.
Maybe within a generation or two, everyone in their family will speak English. So, Paul McBride, let's wrap up with this. The complexities and nuances you've been discussing here don't often penetrate the current debate in our country, which is marred by a lot of partisan finger-pointing. How do we get to the point where we might actually start solving this problem, coming up with some workable solutions?
I guess my final conclusion about the border as an issue is that if we're thinking of a solution that will hermetically seal us off from all of those problems, it's probably not possible.
Or wise?
Because you can't seal off a 2,000-mile border that separates rich people from poor people. Poor people are going to flee, especially poor people who are leaving because of the terror of the lives they lead in their home countries. But as far as the partisanship now, making it all the more difficult, there's no question of that. And my fear is that we have become so energized and divided on these related issues that it makes it all but impossible to address them reasonably. I don't think that there's anything going on at the border right now that we haven't faced in the past. We have always had surges for one reason or another across the southern border. This can be done. When Castro in 1980 allowed the Muriel people, the Murielitos, to come over to the United States, again, about 125,000. And boy, he was picking the worst. He emptied his prisons, he emptied his mental institutions, and we had some difficulty with that. And Carter, this was the last year of the Carter administration. And what he did was he opened up a number of military bases, moved people to those military until they could all be sorted out. And we ended up deporting a number of thousands of those back to Cuba because they were found to be really serious criminals. But the rest, it took a while, but it is addressable. And it didn't seem to be at the time. It was every bit as much of a terrible crisis as what we're facing now. We have the ability, this country can certainly develop the infrastructure, put more immigration judges available, make the procedure of vetting these people more efficient. And it's clear that people, the thousands that are applying for refugee status or who are here applying for asylum, the majority of them, once we address them, they'll be deported. They're not gonna qualify, but we'll have procedures that can be applied. I can't imagine that the United States of America cannot do this humanely and efficiently.
Paul McBride, we thank you for your perspective on an issue that's always been front and center in the American story. On the next episode of History as It Happens, where art thou, William?
The race for next president of the United States will be between Jimmy Carter, the defender, and Ronald Reagan, the challenger.
William F. Buckley marshaled his formidable mind to propel the conservative movement to the halls of power, where today Congresswoman Liz Cheney, as true a conservative as any, might be ousted from her leadership role in the Republican Party. What is going on here? We'll speak to the editor of Buckley's flagship magazine, The National Review, about the past, present, and future of conservatism. Next, when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.